So welcome again to the Star Library for our monthly, one of our monthly programs on local history. And this evening our speaker is Brian Plum. Brian works in the Boston area. His professional training is in science and engineering, has a master's in mechanical engineering, and works as the finance director for an energy company. But in his spare time, he is a member of a fife and drum corps, actually several of them, in Sudbury. And his other connection, his other extracurricular activity is that he writes books about local history. He's written one about the history of the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, one of the oldest hotels in America. And he's also recently written one about the Beekman Arms. Actually, Brian is a native of Hyde Park, and even though he's an expatriate, we welcome him back to town. And delighted to have you here. He spent incredible amounts of time here researching material that we have in our archives, and I know he's spent a lot of time at the museum in addition to the New York Historical Society and the Smithsonian, and who knows where else, researching this book. It's a magnificent book, and we're delighted to have him here this evening to talk about the history of the Beekman Arms. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. And I guess I should just, it's appropriate to start by thanking the Rhinebeck Historical Society, Museum of Rhinebeck History, the town of Rhinebeck, and the Beekman Arms for the support in putting this book together. And it wouldn't have been put together without their help. And specifically, I'd like to point out Mike Frazier, Dave Miller, both of the Rhinebeck Historical Society, Beverly Kane, and Nancy Kelly, who helped out significantly putting this book together in terms of, answering my questions, giving me access to the data, talking about things in the town, proofreading the manuscript. So I'm grateful for their help and friendship. I suppose you may want to know, Mike gave an introduction, you got most of it right, but I thought maybe you'd want to know a little bit about Matthew and myself, just to know why we would even be remotely qualified to write a book or talk about the Beekman Arms. And, as Mike said, I'm a Hyde Park kid, and like probably most of you guys, I grew up fascinated by those little milestone markers, in the stone buildings and the country estates and the Rhinebeck Aerodrome, and all that stuff it's certainly inside of me. And my son's a senior in college, and he's studying history and English, and he was just an excellent co-author for me, because he added significantly to the writing part of this. And I taught him a lot about research as well. And so professionally, like Mike said, I'm actually in corporate finance. I've spent the last 20 years doing mergers and acquisitions. And that job is really diving into companies, building financial models around them, detailed due diligence, pulling the companies apart, and detailed research, figuring out how they work, figuring out where the risks are. And I think the skills that I learned, those research skills I learned, and the tools that I have at my disposal to do research, is what gave me the ability to do the research necessary to put this book together. And as Mike said, I'm also involved with a couple bands up in the Boston area, and my association with one of the bands, which is attached to this place called the Wayside Inn, had me, I've been going there for like the last 15 years, playing music every week there. And, as I was going there, I just started collecting material on the Wayside Inn and on all kinds of other taverns around the Northeast as well. So I put this website together and started building this whole database of old colonial taverns, which was going really well until the Russian hackers decided to attack it with their viruses. And it took it down like multiple times, and I finally gave up. But it's okay. But then somebody said to me, "Why don't you write a book?" And I'm like, I don't know. I guess I could do that. So I had all this data, and Also, on that website, I actually had a whole detailed history of the Beekman arms to the extent that I can get it, surface level. So I wrote this book about the Wayside Inn, which came out. I thought it came out kind of nice, and as part of the research on the Wayside Inn book, I got into the whole thing about which is the oldest tavern and whatnot. So I got back into researching the Beekman arms, and then when I got done with the Wayside Inn book, I was somewhat exhausted from that process. And I kept thinking about the Beekman arms, and then I said, nobody's ever really written a book about the Beekman arms. And just my luck, when I'm thinking about this, somebody else is going to come up with the idea to write a book about the Beekman arms. So I said, I better kind of execute here. And so I talked to my publisher, and I proposed this book idea to them, and they said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And I didn't really have the energy when I started, because I kind of knew what I was getting into with the Beekman arms, because the history in the Beekman arms is like clouded in this big dark cloud, and I knew it was going to be difficult, but it was fun. And I think, I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? Okay. So that's where the story starts. So let me try to do this, Mike, if I can get this clicker. Everybody's seen this picture before, right? It's the stained glass behind the bar at the Beekman Arms. And it's circa 1935. It's original to the bar. And wait up, no, Mike. Oh, did you turn it on? There we go. So here's where our story starts. And I'm going to kind of like jump off from where the known history is of the Beekman Arms. And most people know Howard Morris's brilliant book, History of Rhinebeck, or Historic Old Rhinebeck. He wrote it in 1908. A guy 27 years earlier, in 1881, wrote another book. This was Edward Smith in 1881. Wrote a book, History of Rhinebeck, which and Edward Smith was the editor of the Rhinebeck Gazette, and he knew a lot of people. So his book was more of a genealogical study, and he didn't really say anything about the Beekman Arms in his book. And Howard had most of what was on the Beekman Arms in his book, and it was just very, very brief. And during the course of the research of the Beekman Arms, I read a lot. And let me also say that I'm going to use the word I, but I should be using the word we, because my son helped out a lot. But I'm getting caught up in speaking here, and just forgive me for saying I, but you know what I'm talking about. So I've read everything on the Beekman Arms and on the newspaper. I've gone through probably 500 newspaper articles, all the books, magazines, the sales material going back to the 1920s on the Beekman Arms. Everything says exactly the same thing. William Traphagen was the first settler here. He built the first tavern in town. It wasn't well situated, so his grandson, Aaron, built the Beekman Arms. And that story has been propagated for the last 106 years, and everybody says that story. And who knows, I think, Morse was a well-respected man in town, Civil War veteran, officer one of the Rhinebeck regiments. He was an attorney. He was born in 1842. So by the time I guess he came of age, which was probably like 1855 or so, he was probably talking to his parents and his, in the generation before him, and he probably had a connection to, say, the past 50 years. So probably reliable going back to maybe turn of the century. But you couldn't possibly know what happened 100 years ago. And I think that's where he kind of got caught up. And I think I should also say that his book was self-published, which isn't a bad thing. But he didn't have any editorial standards behind him checking to make sure everything was right, and he didn't footnote his book, and that's what kind of tripped me up. I love this book, and I'm reading it. I'm like, where did he get that from? And you can't tell because he just wrote, and so that was the difficult part. It was good to it was good to have it, of course, because it kind of points you in the right direction. But then you got to start checking facts. And Matthew, this is my son Matthew. Matthew and I, we spent 2 years writing this book, and we had the benefit of his work. We also had historical societies which had collected material, and of course we had the internet, and obviously how important that is to research nowadays. So I honestly believe if we didn't have the internet, this book probably would have taken 5 or 10 years to write. But we covered a lot of ground in the last 2 years. So as I said, I think Morse did the very best he could with what he had. And I think that's what history is. You know, history is sort of like jumping wave top to wave top to wave top and just kind of grabbing those little pieces of history that you can find here and there. And I think that's one of the reasons why Henry Ford got in trouble a long time ago. He said history is bunk. And everybody got all upset about him for saying that. And what he meant to say is that nobody really knows the real history because most of the real history isn't even written, hasn't been recorded. You know, the history that's been recorded has been recorded by, you know, kings and queens and aristocracy and the people who had the capability of actually recording something and putting it someplace so it is preserved through time. And you know, there just wasn't a lot of material for Morse or Smith to work with. So I think they did the best they could with what they had. And what kind of tripped me up with Morse's book is one of the, and I'm not trying to disparage his book in any way, shape, or form, but you know, just a little critical analysis here, I suppose, is what's happening. You know, I read that little advertisement he had in his book when he was talking about the Trapehagen Tavern. And I said, you know, I have read that before. I have heard that before, exactly those words, and I couldn't remember where it was. And then I dug up my circa 1900 book, Stagecoach and Tavern Days by Alice Earl Morris, which is a classic book on historic taverns. It's a, you know, I'm not sure it's entirely scholarly, but it's just a great book to, you know, you can buy it online for like $10. But if you like old colonial taverns, it's sort of a must-have in your library. And she had that ad. This came from her book. And what Morse did is I think, he took the ad and took out the stuff that didn't relate to Rhinebeck and just used the rest of the ad and put it in there. And because I mean, it's like word for word identical to that advertisement. Same thing on the iconic picture of the Beekman Arms. And you know, everybody thinks that that's what the Beekman Arms look like, and he says this is the Beekman Arms in 1769. And here's what the Beekman Arms looked like in 1849. That's from a newspaper. And I think what he did, obviously, you can kind of see the similarities here. He took that, and this is, you know, when he was alive, he saw it like this. He didn't need the newspaper article. But, you know, here, this looks, you know, identical to that. There was another famous painting that came out of Francis Tavern, had the Dutch gam barrel roof. So either he heard stories from his, you know, from his grandparents of how the Beekman Arms may have looked, or he may have just kind of used, you know, some adaptive reasoning to put a little Dutch gam barrel roof on the Beekman Arms. Because the one map that actually shows the, you know, the house that is in the location of the Beekman Arms, it clearly doesn't have a gamma roof on it. But you got to be careful about maps, because maps are like a snapshot in time. You know, somebody could make a map in 1798. In 1799, the building could be completely changed. So you got to be a little bit careful, thinking that, you know, you look at a map and you think you know what you're looking at, and that just is something temporary. So what else did I say? Okay, so this is a lot to go through. But this is how I approached the book. But we're not going to go through this presentation like this. And this column over here, these are all the owners of the Beekman Arms. And so Matthew and I, we went to the Dutchess County Registry of Deeds, and we connected all the dots from one owner to the next owner to the next owner, which is actually it's quite interesting because we found some really cool old documents in the Registry of Deeds. This next column over here, this is the landlords. And you know, that bronze plaque that you guys see outside at the front of the Beekman Arms, those are the landlords. Those aren't necessarily the owners of the Beekman Arms. And some of the landlords actually only owned it for a few years, so I wouldn't even necessarily call them landlords. They were more like, you know, managers. And some of them actually clearly owned it for quite a long time. The Beekman Arms also went by multiple names. You know, we've known it for the last 97 years as the Beekman Arms. But for, you know, a good part of its life, it was the Rhinebeck Hotel, and I think most of you guys know that. But before it was the Rhinebeck Hotel, it had a couple unique names like McElroy's Hotel Marquardt's Hotel. There was a, the owner at the time changed the name to suit his needs. But there was one period in time, back in 1805, that kind of made the Beekman Arms famous. I think it's pronounced Jacques Hotel. Is it Jacques or Jakes? Jakes. I call it Jakes, but I know it's probably Jacques. And he was the first person who really created the hotel business in the Beekman Arms, based on what I've found in my research. So here's how we're going to kind of approach this presentation tonight. There was the early Dutch colonial period, which I find the most interesting. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time, talking about that period. There's the whole stagecoach period of the Albany Post Road, and the Beekman Arms being a stagecoaching house. Fortunately, we're probably not going to touch on that too much tonight. I spent 2 chapters of it in the book, which I had a lot of fun writing, because a lot of that had not been covered before. So it was a lot of fun just uncovering, old advertisements, old travel journals, and talking about how when they came to Rhinebeck, this is what they saw. So if you're interested in that, you'll find that in the book. The Jacques Hotel era, which was the first real glory days of the Beekman Arms. And then the railroads came, and then there was the Civil War period, of course. And you can see during the Civil War, actually I have a little pointer here. During the Civil War over here, there's just like, they just a year or two, and it was, as I say at the top of the presentation, I mean, the history of the Beekman Arms is sort of like, there's a big ebb and flow of business, of it actually being very vibrant, and new renovations and new ways of doing business. And there's often times where it's described as being ramshackled, and it's gone out of business twice, and the mortgage has been foreclosed on it. But there was also this period after the Civil War called people call it the Gilded Age, from 1870 to 1900, when the new mansions came into town. That's also the period of the violent explosion in Rhinebeck. And you can imagine everything kind of like going through that center intersection of town. Electricity, running water, and heat came to the Beekman Arms during that period. After the violent period, just as in the middle of the Depression, as World War I was starting, we had Wally Foster and Tracy Dow's combine and take over the Beekman Arms and buy the Beekman Arms. We'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. And then during World War II was when Louis Winnie came, and maybe some of maybe your generation remember Louis Winnie, I don't know. And then there was the Charles LaForge era, which we're probably not going to talk too much about that tonight. In fact, when you get to the LaForge slide, we're just about done with the presentation. So he lives down in Florida very comfortably in a very multi-million-dollar house. I went down and visited. Very nice man, and he shared a lot of information, a lot of photographs with me. So it was great making his acquaintance. So the Dutch colonial period. Let's start there. Vinny, can you see okay? Yeah. All right. Morse was right talking about William Traphagen being the first settler in town, and Aaron Traphagen, not his grandson but his son, was a person who was important in the history of early Rhinebeck. And I'm talking about the village. I'm not talking about Rhinecliff. But before I dive into the center of town, let's just step back a little bit here and look at some of the geography and how some of the Indian trails and what was significant about the location of Rhinebeck. And anyone who does research on Indian trails will confirm what I'm about ready to say, that it's probably the most difficult things to research. And nobody's written a definitive book on Indian trails in New York. And if everyone wants to, that's a good book idea for somebody. God bless you for trying to find some research on that. But there were 2 really important trails on the western side of the Hudson. One of them, started at the Roundup Creek by land went over to the Esopus Creek and then followed around that creek for a while, and then followed the valley down through Ellenville, all the way down to Port Jervis here on the Delaware River. And so that was the main route for the natives to travel down to the Delaware River if they didn't take the Hudson. Over time, it became known as the Old Mine Road. Apparently very famous. It's been disputed whether or not this mining connection is actually true. And it was said to be a Dutch mining road, where the Dutch would come down from Kingston and mine in the Allegheny Plateau. But people have said that the minerals that are in the Allegheny Plateau, you couldn't possibly mine with the metals that the Dutch had at the time. So it's been disputed. But the road is ancient. That Route 209 through the back of the mountains there, ancient road. The other ancient road is the road that's Route 28 through the mountains, and we call it now the Oneonta Trail. But it comes to the backside, right on the other side of, on 209, just on the backside of by the thruway over there, and it goes up through the mountains. I'll pull my little extension thing out here a little bit more. So it goes up through the mountains here, and it goes all the way over to the Susquehanna River, which is kind of surprising. That's out by Binghamton, New York. And it actually terminates up here in Bainbridge, New York, but it's just up the river from Binghamton, and that's where the Susquehanna River flows, and the Susquehanna goes into Chesapeake, and this goes into Delaware Bay. And as it comes across the river here, we know this section of the highway, we've called that the Sepaska Trail. We've heard that word before. Again, you're looking at documentation of old Indian trails. That word never appears, Sepaska Trail. I kind of think it's a contemporary name for the trail. I have no idea when it would have started. The Sepaska Indians were identified in some old Beekman papers, so we know that the tribe actually existed. But whether or not that trail name is real, I just didn't get into that depth of research. But that old road that I just described here, that's that Ulster and Salisbury Turnpike that everybody's heard about. And so that's the connection. And it goes across the river right here at Kingston Landing, because that's the narrowest part of the river. And I think, if you look at this old drawing right here, and this is from an 1802 map that I have later in the presentation, and it shows that the trail comes down here and it goes to Longdock, and it goes off that little spit of land here, which they call Radcliffe's Landing, and it goes across the river at Radcliffe's Landing. Now, it's been argued that maybe it's not Radcliffe's Landing that the trail terminated. Maybe it's Slate Dock down half a mile down, down the road here. And that might be possible because Henry Beekman's stone house was at the top of Slate Dock Road, so he may have, who knows, maybe he wanted to see all the traffic going by his house. One more thing on this map that I wanted to or two more things I wanted to point out is that inscription on that bronze plaque that we see every day down in the center of town. And it basically says, Connecticut pioneers traveled through here to the new homes in Western New York. And I looked all over for what that meant. And when the DIR put that, and I found a newspaper article about when they actually installed this. There's nothing significant about the boulder. It's just a glacial boulder. But it says nothing about this, so I don't know what they were talking about. So they were probably talking about them coming across the river and going out that way to Binghamton, New York. But there's nothing that I could tell that was significant or notable about some grand migration west by the Connecticut citizens. And one other thing I wanted to point out is just the vastness of hydropower up the Landsman's Hill. And I know most of you guys recognize that, but there was at least 6 large waterfalls capable of sustaining grist and sawmills, which were necessary for early colonial developments. The one down here in Vandenberg Cove, I found this picture, which I thought was pretty interesting. Does anybody recognize this? It's a Hudson River School painting. Thomas Cole. Yeah, sunset, mill at sunset. Sunset at the mill. And I could be wrong, but when I saw this, I'm like, oh, that kind of looks like the cove. And you got to take the Catskill Mountains, kind of shift them up this way a little bit. But you got the mill race coming across here off the top of it, which is probably the way you had the mill configured at the time. And I've actually been told that the original grist mill for the mill is actually sitting in the mud over here somewhere, so I'm gonna go look for that someday. It's just an interesting picture. So in New York, unlike in New England, where in New England when you bought a piece of property, you got clear title to it, and you were a free landholder. In New York, things were done much differently, and it started from obviously from the Dutch customs, and back from the early 1600s. So they broke apart all of New York into large patents and manors, and I'm showing on this really interesting 1895 map that there's a resource on the internet called davidrumsey.com, and you can find all kinds of high definition maps on the website. It's a great resource. I contacted him when I wrote the book, and I got permission from him to use a couple of his maps in the book. So you can see there's all these large manors and patents. So there was 266 in New York, and there's a few Indian reservations that made up the total, but that's a lot of patents, and they were large. And this is really just the small ones in Dutchess in this area of Dutchess County. So here's Dutchess County, like right here, starts like right here. Here's Rhinebeck right here, 9 partners patent, and it comes right here. And then just above Dutchess County, obviously, is Livingston Manor, and then below it was it says Phillips's Highland patent, but this is Putnam County and Portland Manor. So let's take a quick look at Dutchess County, but let me jump into a real quick genealogy of the Beekman family. And I know you guys have heard this thing, the Beekman story a million times, but maybe you haven't heard it in the last week. So let me just kind of refresh your memory, because it's probably important just to it's kind of fun and it's interesting to connect the dots. So William Beekman, the original forefather, he came over in 1647 aboard the ship Princess with Peter Stuyvesant, said to be an officer in the Dutch West Indies Company. Wealthy, obviously, influential man. Took a couple official positions throughout the Dutch colony, starting in New York, then going down to Delaware, and then going up to Kingston, and becoming the sheriff of Kingston. Eventually went back then to New York, became assistant mayor of New York, and really started acquiring his wealth when he was in New York. He had a number of children. One of them was Giraldus Beekman, Dr. Giraldus Beekman, famous surgeon at the time. He's a direct forefather of Franklin Roosevelt. So Roosevelt always felt a strong connection to Rhinebeck and the Beekman family, through his genealogy. Another one of his children was, I think he had 10 children. I don't remember. Another one of his children was Henry Beekman. So Judge Henry Beekman, when William went up to Kingston, Judge Beekman traveled with him, and he stayed in Kingston, and he became a county judge. And while he was in Kingston, he petitioned Lord Hyde for a patent in Dutchess County, and he applied twice, and the second time he applied, it actually came through the way he wanted it to come through in 1703, and he actually received it on the same date, the large Beekman patent down here, and then the Rhinebeck Beekman patent up here. And let me finish going through this before I jump into the Beekman patent. So Henry had a number of children, and most of his daughters actually got control of the Beekman patent down here. It was all sliced up, given to his daughters. His son got most of the Beekman patent, and Colonel Henry Beekman was a very notable and influential member of Rhinebeck. I failed to mention that Judge Henry actually never lived in Dutchess County at all. He lived in Kingston his whole life. So Colonel Henry Beekman was a resident of Rhinebeck. He lived in that stone house down in Rhinecliff, and his name is on every deed. He donated land to build the Dutch Reformed Church. He sold the first piece of property to William Traphagen, his daughter, Margaret Beekman Livingston, she was the last of the Beekman line. Colonel Henry's his son died early. Margaret Beekman, everybody knows, the iconic picture of Margaret, and she had 10 children, and one of her children was another Henry Beekman Livingston, and she had, all 10 of her children were famous in some regard, and I cover that in the book, but we don't have any time for that today. So there was a connection between Judge Henry Beekman and William Traphagen, and they came from Kingston together. And I connect the dots. I connect them, the two of those, in some official documents, and so they must have known each other in town. And it's said that, well, you can tell when in the old days when they would put their name on deeds, they would actually put down next to their name what their occupation was, or what they wanted to be designated as. And William Traphagen designated himself as a wheelwright, which is a person who makes wagon wheels, which could also be a person who makes mill wheels. It's sort of speculative, I suppose. So there's a premise that perhaps Judge Henry Beekman brought William Traphagen over to Rhinebeck to help build the first mill in town, which was the first mill in town was down in Vandenberg Cove, and that's said to be circa 1710. The ones here up in town, there's a deed. And we don't really have a lot of time to talk about it, but there's a deed in 1719 of William actually selling that property to Henry for mills to be erected. So I kind of sense that the mills in town were built around 1719. So William got the first property from Judge Beekman, and I should say that getting land is one thing, but making money is another. And so what those patent holders would do is they would lease property and they would collect rents. They would mine for minerals. They would chop down trees in forests. They would build mills, and they would be the center of commerce and charge people to grind. So that's how these wealthy people accumulated and built more wealth. And so he sold property to William Traphagen, but it wasn't really a sale, because everything in New York was never a sale. It was always like a perpetual lease. And so William actually had to pay Judge Beekman 6 shillings a year forever, and his heirs were supposed to pay Judge Henry Beekman's heirs forever, 6 shillings a year. And one of the coolest things I found down in Princeton University in their archives is I actually found Beekman's account book to William Traphagen, and you can see he's actually starting to tally up some of the payments. And this goes on for a few pages. So William got this interesting piece of property, and this deed is actually up in the Ulster County Department Bureau of Records in Kingston. And he got a piece of land that's bounded by the Landsman's Kill, the Rhinebeck Kill, and on the eastern side by a line that starts at a fir tree marked with 3 notches and a cross by the aforementioned run of water. And this eastern boundary was disputed forever. But let's kind of zoom in on what he actually bought. So this is the property. And this is a map. This is, I believe it's a 1769 map. It's an enigma. And I go through it. I spent a lot of time on this map in the book. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. But it shows the outline of the property, and that's what it was. So here's the Rhinebeck Kill and the Landsman's Kill, starting from Crystal Lake here, and then going down here where the streams tie together. So all this land in here was Traphagen's land. So now it's his original 281 acres. And William split the land with his stepson, Ari Hendricks, and when he came of age in 1710, Ari got the western part, and William kept the eastern part. And so right now we're right here in the Star Library, sitting on William Traphagen's land. Ari was a cooper, so a cooper is a barrel maker, and in another ancient document says that he actually had a brew house. So I'm not exactly sure where Ari's house would have been, but I kind of suspect maybe it was this home lot right here. I don't know if anybody knows those people who live in this house. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the original Harry Hendricks house. And Harry sold his property back to Beekman in 1765. So it'd probably be very difficult to do deed research back to Harry, because those early deeds, they weren't all collected. One of the I show a little interesting picture video that you might like. This is Gunter's chain. That's this is the way that they would stretch this chain through the wilderness, and they'd have, they have a compass, and you can imagine, taking this chain and a compass and going through like a wilderness like this and trying to plot land. And that's one of the reasons why I have spent an exhaustive amount of time trying to plot different, different plots and trying to figure out exactly where these things were, and it's very difficult to do. But let's zoom in on this little section like right here, because I think you might find this interesting. And there's a lot of data on here, but let me explain it to you, because I think you might find this interesting. And this took a long time to create this map. So here's the dividing line that I pointed out before. Here's where the two mills the two streams come together. So William had 3 children: William Jr., Chaisa, and Aaron. And I'm probably pronouncing Aaron's name wrong. It's probably like Chint. Chint Chaisa, and William Jr. And William's his land, I couldn't find where it was. And in addition to this 281 acres that William bought, he also bought another 290 acres just on the other side of the landsman's scale. And William's name is tied to being one of the millers in one of the mills. So I have sort of a view, I suppose, that William got, that 290 acres south of the landsman's scale. There was William had a will in 1736, which actually got distributed in 1741, and it describes clearly what Chaisa's land was, and it was this piece of property like right here. So we're sitting in the Star Library, right in Chaisa's farm field. I believe her house was here. This is the location. So this is the Beekman Arms is here at the corner. Right? Here's the main intersection of town, obviously. Beekman Arms is here. The old BB's restaurant back in the woods back here. I believe that was the location. There's an old path next to the old blacksmith shop that goes back there, and there's a spring back there as well. And I believe that's where the original old dwelling house was, because that 1741 deed says that Chaisa got this property, plus she got 1/3 of the old dwelling house. And I think, William had his own dwelling house, so he didn't need Chaisa's third. Aaron, I'll explain in a second, lived over here. So she got the old dwelling house, which I think was William Traphagen's original home location right here. Chaisa also got lot number 1, which is that that nice big piece of open property over here. What we found interesting recently on that is there was actually an old deed, 1790 deed, that actually described this quarter-acre burying place. And Nancy, Mike, and I we went back through the woods here, looking around, and we kind of rediscovered, like right here at this location, the old crypt that's back in the woods. And of course the village idiots got to it first, so they spray painted it with all kinds of things. But that is in my view, that's a significant historical site, and I hope that kind of Rhinebeck does something to protect it at some point. And I kind of think it's a Traphagen property, because Beverly told me that Kerstadt was buried in the Rhinebeck cemetery, and nobody knows where any of the Traphagens were buried. So it's quite possible that was the burying place for the Traphagen family. A couple of the lots here that I just want to point out. Aaron's home lot was right behind the Beekman Arms, and I believe his house was right here, right next to Garden Street. And I go into exhaustive detail about some of the some of the logical reasoning of why I think that's Aaron's house. I'm not going to cover that tonight. but this was his home lot right here, probably extended up Oak Street as well. There was another piece of property down here. There was a triangular piece of property in a mill lot right here. These became identified. See if there's anything else we need to talk about in this map. This is Aaron's property. Lot 2 was Aaron's. Oh yeah, let me, one more thing if I could. This piece of property that's just to the right of, or to the north of Kreis's home lot, was in fact, in 1769, Dr. Hans Kerstadt bought Kreis's home lot. He actually lived in this house for a little bit of time. He bought Kreis's home lot, and then this whole piece of property that's bounded by this black line right here goes up this way and then back over here. This piece of property is described in the 1774 land exchange between Dr. Hans Kerstadt and the next owner of this property down here, which was Everardus Bogartus. And there was an exchange of property, and it's not clear what was exchanged, but it is clear that that 1774 deed clearly outlines this piece of property. And Dr. Hans Kerstadt lived here at first, and then he built his house here, supposedly, in 1793, and he moved here, and that's that house at 57 Market Street. I have a little picture of it later on. Most of you guys are probably familiar with that one. So, 1746 map. So this is the you know, that little property down at the bottom of the map I just showed you. So in 1746, Aaron Traphagen exchanged with Henry Beekman an acre and a half for 2 1/3 acre. And it's not entirely clear, because I have the original deed here, it's not entirely clear what Henry got in this exchange. He seemed to have gotten the better of the deal, so you wonder why they exchanged properties. And frankly, it's sort of an enigma. What's interesting about this map is it does show House of Traphagen right here, you know, at the corner of this map. So Aaron got this piece of property right here, and so we know for sure when the land around the Beekman Arms was actually secured from the first patent holder. So that was 1746. And so it gets actually cloudier. It's a cool map, but things get stranger here. Let me start up here. So this is the map that we were just looking at, and this is in the Dutchess County Registry of Deeds. And they just took all the ancient documents down there. And I know you wouldn't want to go out of your way to see this, but it was kind of amazing. I guess they got a new registrar down there. And they decided to take all the ancient documents, which I used to have to ask for, and you put them in these red binders out in the middle of the room for anybody to access. So I'm not sure that's the smartest thing to do, but it's been done. So you have the original 1746 deed is there, and you can hold it kind of in your hands. It's in a glass sleeve. Down in Princeton University, there's Henry Beekman's copy, and he actually shows the house of A. Traphagen. So the Dutchess County one doesn't say A. Traphagen, so this says, you know, A. Traphagen for Aaron Traphagen. Now it kind of looks a little bit like it's on in the inside side of the triangle, but I might be reading a little bit too much into the drawing. So this map here is a great find. Nancy pointed it out to me. So I traveled down to Princeton University, and I got you know, I had the money to reproduce it. So you can see the mill complex down here, mill house. Here's that triangle that we looked at before. But there's just something strangely wrong, and it's the original Dutch Reformed church before they rebuilt it in 1807, I think. Right? So that's the original church. But there's something strange about this, in that intersection is supposed to be right here. I mean, when you read the deed, it says that this connection is supposed to be right here, and this connection is supposed to be down further. So you wonder if this whole thing should be shifted downwards. And I have looked at this map ad nauseum and tried to figure this thing out. But if you shift this thing down, it totally screws up the mill property, and it just didn't work. So I tend to think that the road probably was drawn improperly, because you know it doesn't really look all that exact the way that they've got it in there. So I think you can't read too much into this illustration. The important thing in this map, what I'm showing here is this structure, which I have a suspicion, a sense that that could be the original Beekman Arms. And I'm a little bit skeptical, but I have a, based on the fact that it's on the lower part of the triangle down here, and not on the tip. And if it was on the tip, then it would clearly be Aaron's house up here. But it's drawn in the lower part of the triangle, and Simon Cole is the son of Gijsa, William's daughter. And he became the heir at law for all of Gijsa's, and likely Aaron's property. And I don't know that as a fact, but Aaron only had daughters, so it's possible that Simon became the heir at law for all the Traphaven property. But the other thing that I know is that that property that's up here, Aaron's house, it didn't become Simon's until 1770. And this map is supposedly 1769. And it wouldn't say S. Cole on it. It was owned by Hans Kerstadt. So that's why I kind of suspect that this might be the Beekman Arms. But that's the best I could do on that. Here's another document. I'll just go through this quickly. I don't want to, but that Aaron's house right here shows up on this 1810 map, and it's a reproduction, the 1920 reproduction. The Dutchess County Registry tells me that none of the original maps still exist anymore. So doing the best to kind of do the best we can with what we got here. So here's Aaron's house. Here's Jacques' hotel for the very first time, and this shows the extension on Jacques' hotel. And this is probably why there was a conclusion drawn in Morse's book that the addition was built sometime around he said by Asa Potter, but it's around 1810 that the addition was built. But I found this map and I'm like, boy, that's an odd looking triangle. And I go, wonder where that is. And I saw the King's Highway and I said, well, that's got to be the post road. But it's not. I mean, this is West Market Street. And and when I found this, it made sense. Because you take this, obviously you take this and you flip it around, and it becomes this property right down here. And so that house would have been like right here at the corner. And as I said, Simon didn't get that property until 1770. So the next owner was Everardus Bogardus. And Bogardus. How do you pronounce it?
Bogardus.
Bogardus, yes. Another enigma, because there's all this Revolutionary War history tied to Bogardus, and Washington was up there, and Lafayette probably came up as what Morse tells us, and quite frankly, I couldn't find anything that supported those types of assertions. And this is, let me give you the story that I'm kind of developing in my thought process here. I think if you squint your eyes a little bit and turn around backwards, this is kind of like, I kind of picture this as how the center of Rhinebeck may have looked back in 1769, where you had the post road very vibrant, with the drovers, cattle drovers, and the wagons, and then there was a trading house right in the center of town. And the thing I found out about Everardus is that every single official document, deed, will, mortgage, identified him as a merchant, not as an innkeeper. And this is a 1797 document. And, there may have been a time period where Everardus actually let out rooms to, as an inn, but it's just totally, it's unclear. I can't substantiate that. But it's entirely possible that, it was a large house. He was the principal merchant in town. He was probably looking for any way he could to make money. What I also found out about Everardus is that he acquired a significant amount of property. And when he died, he had property going down to the Hudson River, and he had property going all the way down to Statsburg. This is up in the New York State Archives, and this is Everardus' property on the other side of, I think it's Mill Road over here. Right, and here's where the creeks come together, and then they show a mill down here. 1797. And so my contention is that he was a He was a commodity trader. He was somebody, his whole family, the whole Bogardas family, they were slope operators. And everybody knows the whole Bogardas family history. And they were one of the earliest families, Dutch families in New York, and I won't get into that right now. But you know, what I thought was important to show you guys is some of the maps that were contemporary to his time period. To also show you that, you know, there's no tavern there. And so this is a map, this is the Robert Erskine map that was done for George Washington. And 10 years later, there was another map that I think was just a direct copy of Erskine's map. And here at the intersection in town, right here, there's 2 dots. And one of them likely was to Beekman Arms. But there's no mention at all that that's a tavern. In fact, the only tavern that's noted is Trimper's Tavern up here. And Trimper's is probably Tremper's. But back then it was Trimper's. And I'll show you where that was in a second. I've got a pretty cool map. Slide or 2 down. I'm sorry, what was that?
Where's the Trapper one?
Where was it?
Trapper, yeah.
I'll show you in a second. I'll show you in a second.
Okay.
The 1789 map, it only had like 1 dot here at the intersection. So, you know, what happened to the other dot? You know, what happened to, you know, this is either Aaron's house or it's the Beekman Arms. And it's just impossible to tell. And what I've concluded is that Cole's probably never even came to Rhinebeck. Although he was a Kingston resident for some time. His map is spot on, identical to Erskine's map. So I have a view that Christopher Cole's, you know, I describe his map set in the book. And his map set is actually a fairly highly accomplished piece of a manuscript. It's on display down at the Library of Congress right now, you know, under the pretense of books that influenced America. It's said to be the first road atlas in town. And he mapped from Chesapeake Bay up to Albany, New York, you know, with a side jaunt down out to Stratford, Connecticut. So he tried to accomplish a lot, so he may have cut some corners. But his map is identical to Erskine, so I'm not even sure what you're seeing here is 1789. What you're seeing here is probably 1779, and you maybe have made some mistakes just transcribing it over. There's another map, and maybe Nancy, maybe you can help me with this one. This is on the cover of the Rhinebeck album, and I did my damnedest to try to find the original of this map. It's 1778, so a year before Erskine, and nobody knows where this map is. But it's exactly the same as these 2 other maps, so I didn't really lose too much sleep over that. This collection of maps is quite interesting. The people know the Thompson maps, Alexander Thompson maps. So, not too far away from us, probably 100 feet from us, is the first map, the Star Library map. And let me explain these maps. Back in 1797, Alexander Thompson, a local mapsmith, was commissioned to do a map for the state of New York. And he completed the map, gave it to the state of New York. New York State Archives actually has a copy of the map. And then Thompson was, and I believe it was Thompson, it's not clear, but it looks like his handwriting. He made several other copies of the map over the next 2 years. So this is a large map. And, you know, maybe we should have brought it out to show you guys. It shows the entire, you know, town of Rhinebeck. Shows all the old taverns, all the old houses. I wouldn't necessarily say it's definitive, but it's a beautiful map, and it's a great piece of history. A little bit of dispute between myself and some other people on which exactly was the first map. I think the map that the Star Library has, which the Rhinebeck Historical Society has, I think this was the original map because it's got a lot more detail. And then what Thompson did for New York State Archives is he took the detail out and cleaned it up, and he sent that map off to New York. And we'll go through the houses in just a second. And then there was another map then in 1799 which showed a little bit more detail. They had a little bit of a problem drawing the roads in properly. And then there's a map that's in the Library of Congress that wasn't handled too well over the years, but it's the 4th copy of the map. The New York State Archive map's online. You actually can look this up online. This one's online as well. And the Star Library map is back here, and you can ask permission to look at it. This one's down in HRV, down in which has part of the Janet Montgomery collection. down in Tarrytown, New York. But what I wanted to point out in this is the Bogart's Tavern. So here, you see the Bogart's name here, but it doesn't say tavern anywhere. Like there's other taverns in town. There's Potter's Inn, there's Kip's Inn. In in the book I go through the whole inventory of taverns in town. But it says Lodge Room next to it. Same thing here, Montgomery Lodge. And you can't really tell what the colors of that one. This one here looks like it might be the same color as the inns, but it says Montgomery Lodge, which very possibly could be a Masonic temple that actually was organized here in town at that same time period. And here you see a yellow house, which is the color of a house of significance, Bogart's, no tavern designation. You got Kip's, you got Potter's. It's actually Mr. Potter's at this point. And then here the yellow house again, it's not red. And there's another tavern over here now called Cox's. And so it's kind of interesting that just in the 2 years that the map came out, some of the taverns already started changing around. But again, no tavern here. So this is the. I just wanted to show you where the Potter Tavern was in the Tremper Tavern. This is pretty interesting. So what I did is I took the beers map, the 1867 beers map that you gave me, and I found this map in Princeton University. And it was a draft of a copy of the map, and I had to try to find out how to lay that out. And fortunately, the 1867 beers map fit the property outline fairly close. So I photoshopped that into here, and I cleaned it up, and I overlaid over top of the 1867 map. So you can see where the Trimper Tavern. So here's this. In the old days, I guess it was called Cherry Street, but I guess now it's Platt Avenue. But somewhere between Chestnut and Platt